Versailles, Intrigue in the Court of Louis XIV, is the extraordinary encounter of two different universes, high culture and the video game. With this joint production, La Réunion des Musées Nationaux, Canal+, and Cryo are creating a new genre, a cultural CD-ROM in game form. The Chateau of Versailles devoted 2 years of research to the project. Then came 18 months of development, with more than 50 different specialists involved. This cultural adventure game plunges the player into the court of Louis XIV, in a game where reality and imagination go hand in hand. The project was born out of a book published by the Édition Textuelle publishing house. It's written in a journalistic style and generously spiced with anecdotes. The major historic events of the period are illustrated by paintings and illustrations from the time. Louis XIV reigned as absolute sovereign of France, and Versailles is the reflection of his absolute power. But on the morning of June 21st, 1685, a threat hangs over Versailles.
Le joueur est missionné par Bontemps, qui est le premier valet du roi.
Bontemps, first valet to the king and his closest confidant at the time, entrusts the player with a mission. His task is to save the chateau from the destruction which a madman has announced in a pamphlet found in the chateau this very morning. The mission must be accomplished in and around the various ceremonies of court protocol that make up the royal day. Thus it is that by solving a series of enigmas, he becomes familiar with the day-to-day life of the king in 1685. The player becomes Lalande, a valet of the royal bedchamber. To foil the madman's plot, he has to understand court life, its rules, allegiances, and intrigues. The 3D computer-generated images will enable the player to experience the historic reality of the time by plunging him into court life in the chateau of the Sun King. Omni 3D allows the player to become totally immersed in the public and private zones of the chateau and the court of Louis XIV. Omni is a system that has been developed by Cryo over the last year. It allows the player to move about freely in game sets, seeing them through 360 degrees, both horizontally and vertically. All this in high resolution and with an impression of real time. A number of compromises were necessary to meet the different requirements of the game form and those of a serious historical reconstitution. The historical truth of the game is apparent most of all in the different game sets. For the chateau at that period was not at all the same chateau as we know it today. In consequence, the chateau had to be reconstituted as it was in 1685. And the historical characters are based on portraits from the time. But in 1685, there were no longer any conspiracies against the king. For the last 10 years, the king's power had been incontestable and absolute. However, for the purposes of the game, there had to be a villain. This character, who is slightly mad and has hatched a plot to destroy Versailles, is a complete invention. I did not want any historically real political conspiracy in the game, because such a thing would not correspond to reality. The Versailles of 1685 was not the Versailles of the Three Musketeers. The CD-ROM enables us to bring Versailles back to life, to see it as a living place. For the still existing locations, we had to bring together a whole collection of historical and contemporary documents. But in the locations that have disappeared, such as the ambassador's staircase, we had to work solely from engravings, inventories, and paintings from the period. So it's all based on documents from the period. The team of computer graphic artists created the reconstitution with minute attention to detail. Initially, the architecture of the stairs had to be reconstituted, then dressed in textures inspired by period documents. When it came to the characters and the furniture, the job was somewhat more difficult, because there are fewer sources available. We worked from engravings and paintings. For example, this is an engraving of the king as he was in 1685 and dressed as he appears in the game, in the scene where he is preparing for the council. This is an animation of a scene of protocol, which was called the Grand Levé.
Grand levé. Il y a un espace documentaire qui
The
donne...
program also includes a complete documentation zone concerning the court, the chateau, and the history of France in the 17th century.
Alors, cette base documentaire,
It can be accessed by two means in the course of the game, either while visiting the locations and meeting the characters, or it can also be accessed on a theme basis at the beginning of the program. Although the content of the game is cultural, the suggestions made to the player will appeal to his taste for adventure and his sense of intuition. If the story were to remain historically accurate throughout, there would be no game because the history books have been written. There are no longer any unknown factors. For the purposes of the game, we had to introduce surprise elements.